Good afternoon. Currently, all participants are in a listen-only mode. There will be a Q&A session at the end of each module. Throughout the webinar, please enter your questions in the chat Q&A pod located to the left of the presentation. Please type any technical questions in the same pod. Links to download PDFs of the slides and the supporting paper are also listed in a note pod to the left of the presentation. Please cut and paste these links into your web browser for easy download. If at any time you have difficulty hearing the webinar, please dial 866-792-6260 to listen using your phone. I would now like to turn it over to your moderator for today, Shari Zinman.
Hi, thanks, Carrie. This is Shari Zinman. I will be your moderator for today's session. Welcome to the CCH Online webinar, Adapting to a Changing Environment, Guidance on Leadership and Practice Management for In-House Counsel. CCH has developed this online webinar in partnership with the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association. Today's webinar will provide you with an understanding of how to build leadership while being cognizant of authority, roles, and responsibilities. It will cover the strategies corporate counsel can implement in coaching and mentoring employees or student interns. The webinar will also touch on best practices in planning that will enhance efficiency and profitability, as well as help manage change. Upon conclusion of today's session, you will be directed to complete a brief online survey. Those of you who complete the survey will be entered into a draw to win $100. We will provide instructions to access the survey at the end of the webinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to our three keynote speakers. Module 1 with Michel Belec, Vice President Legal Services for Telus, will focus on leadership. Michel Belec is Vice President Legal Services for Telus. He leads a team of legal professionals responsible for complex domestic and international customer and supplier transactions which leverage Telus's capabilities and infrastructure to achieve outstanding results. Michel is a director and officer on various Telus boards and an active supporter of Telus community investment initiatives, induction and learning programs. He has extensive practical experience in telecommunications, corporate commercial law, technology transactions, and governance. Module 2 with Heather Turnbull, President of Turnbull Consulting Group, will focus on coaching and mentoring for corporate counsel. As president of the Turnbull Consulting Group, Heather helps organizations achieve high-quality decisions and implement them effectively. Her experience as a senior management consultant, facilitator, writer, and career development professional spans over 20 years and numerous sectors, including legal, not-for-profit, and financial services. She is also the Canadian Program Officer for the CCCA mentoring program, Counsel Guiding Counsel, now in its 5th year. Her approach draws upon the discipline of the martial arts. Heather is a world champion gold medalist and a 4th-degree black belt martial art artist. A native Maritimer, Heather has proudly volunteered at both executive and community levels in both Ontario and New Brunswick. She presently serves as Global President of the Association of Career Professionals International, as well as Chair of the Board of FAME, Family Association for Mental Health Everywhere, a Canadian charity supporting families and caregivers impacted by mental illness. Last but not least, Module 3 with Robert Fabes, Assistant General Counsel, Canada Post Corporation, will focus on guidance on leadership and practice management for in-house counsel. Robert Fabes is Assistant General Counsel at Canada Post, responsible for all of its legal matters, including the management of a team of 30 legal professionals across Canada. Robert was previously Senior Counsel at Bennett Jones with a practice focusing on corporate commercial matters, corporate governance, and director protection matters for clients in the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. Prior to this, Robert was Senior Vice President, Listings of Toronto Stock Exchange, and General Counsel, Senior Vice President, and Corporate Secretary of GT Group Telecom. So we're going to start things off by just trying to gauge who all our registrants are today. So if you could just take a moment and fill in the following poll. It'll give our speakers an understanding of who you are and what your needs might be. So far, it seems like we are certainly tipping the balance in one direction. Just give it another minute. Okay, well, thank you. I think that gives us a good idea of where we stand. So, without further delay, I will introduce you to our first speaker, Michel Belec of Telus, to start us off with Module 1 on leadership. Welcome, Michel.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome, everyone. I guess I have the distinct privilege here of launching our discussion today, and as a lawyer with management experience, share with you some observations on leadership. It's a somewhat unusual topic for a lawyer, but one that I think has, with time and experience, convinced me of its relevance, whether you work alone, occasionally with groups, or are responsible for teams of individuals. And looking at the results from our polling questions, I see that we do have a number of you that obviously have management responsibility and a number of you that perhaps do not, most, however, being within an in-house position. So I'm hoping that my experience with leadership, which has been built on trial and error, some self-directed study, as well as some formal development activities, will resonate with your daily challenges and aspirations to become more effective as a leader. A lot of the material that I'm going to share with you today is actually based on programs, or if you will, activities from my time at Telus, and I hope that it kind of gives us a bit more of a hands-on perspective to the subject. Now, before I start, I guess some of you are probably wondering what's with a bird. Okay, I thought I'd provide a few comments on my critter here. I wanted to catch your attention, and I hope that worked. I also thought that it'd be nice to find some representation of leadership in the opening slide, and I thought that the crown and the color sort of did that nicely. But more seriously, I like the idea of flight, and I like the parallel to a learning journey, which I think represents what all of our experiences should be with leadership, which it truly is a constant exploration. The showy side of the bird also kind of represents an aspect of leadership which we may have all experienced at some point. You know, the possibly cocky, flamboyant, maybe the even arrogant individual who adopts kind of outward displays of leadership, but in fact has little internal substance. I think if there's one idea in my material that I hope gives you some pause for thought, is that really to be a powerful leader, I think you have to first learn and practice humility. And maybe it would have been better for me to lead off this presentation with a picture of, someone washing another's feet, but my apologies, that doesn't figure in our Telus brand library. So with that said, we've got a fair amount of information to cover. Let's start off here with a quick snapshot of the subjects that are covered by this deck. And I suppose in addition to my simple lesson on humility, I do hope to provide you with a few key thoughts. Hopefully these will help you improve your leadership skills. I truly believe that leadership is something that can be taught. It can be learned, but it does require some investment of time and some effort. And I think we can all achieve various levels of proficiency at leadership using different learning approaches. I think the important concept, however, is to view your leadership development as really an opportunity for constant improvement. I really don't think that there is an end state where you can sit back and say, I've achieved the ultimate in leadership abilities. So how do you go about actually leading teams, and what can you do to actually become a better leader? There are some fundamentals here that I'd like us to look at. So what this slide is intended to represent for you is essentially a summary on a page of what I would call a leadership process or a model. And the idea is that this model should work at various different levels, whether you're responsible for leading a project, whether you're responsible for leading a team of individuals, or whether you're responsible for leading an organization. I really think you should think of this as just a reference point on how to view leadership. And obviously, through the course of our discussion today, I'll provide you some thoughts on each of the 5 principles that you see here. Before I do that, however, I thought it might be fun for me to share with you a reminder that our CEO passed along to me when I explained to him that I was going to be participating in this presentation. And he said, make sure you share with your audience a helpful tip on whether they are actually thinking about or even giving leadership sufficient attention. And what he said was, if you're not anxious about what you've purposely selected not to do, you're not sufficiently focused as a leader, which is really critical if you want to ensure that your teams deliver on their vital priorities. So with that little pearl, let me tell you a little bit about the model, and let me spend a little bit of time describing each of these principles. So if we start with strategy, what is the point? Well, I think that as a leader, clearly you need to help define a clearly articulated understanding of whatever your team needs to get done. And you think, and you have to be mindful that once you've defined that strategy, be mindful that it needs to be assessed and it needs to be refined regularly. And if you're actually responsible for a legal department, that assessment process should happen on a regular basis. If you're leading a project, you need to develop a timeline within which you think it necessary or appropriate to review your strategies. And when you're contemplating how to assess and review your strategies, here's a thought on how you can go about formulating your thinking on that strategy. The way I approach it at Telus on an annual basis with the teams that I'm responsible for is I ask them to look at key pressure points, key factors that impact what we do and how likely we are to succeed in achieving our objectives. And so the first thing we look at are industry economics. What's happening in our market? What's happening in sort of technology that affects how we work and what we do? What does the competitive landscape look like? What are people in private practice proposing, offering, developing that impacts how we provide services to our clients? What do our clients, what do our customers require of us? Don't assume that that remains unchanged or constant. It is in total fluctuation, certainly within the telecom industry, and never resides in any form of status quo for probably more than a period of weeks. So ask yourselves, what is it exactly that customers require of you? And then what is your legal and regulatory environment like? Where do you practice? What are some of the jurisdictional or regulatory developments that might be relevant to how you provide services? And finally, do you really understand what your core competencies are? What truly distinguishes you from anyone else who could provide legal services to your organization or to the project that you're supporting? I think if you look at these pressure points, it really does help you test the appropriateness of your strategy, and it ensures that it continues to remain relevant. And I think as a leader, what becomes a real key attribute is that you stay focused on that strategy. You almost embrace it in a disciplined way, even when it may prove to be inconvenient to do so. So we talked about the 5 principles that are summarized on this model of leadership, and the first one is culture. And I think most of you have probably read the academic and the business literature that makes clear that if you have a unique and a defining culture, you can create an environment that will enable you to have a competitive advantage. And there are simple ways or simple disciplines that you can encourage as a leader. And these disciplines should help you build a culture within your teams that achieves that level of distinction. Now, some of these disciplines are fairly obvious, and some of these come from experience that I've had at Telus. I've summarized them here on the slide, but let me tell you a little bit about what they actually mean in practice. So we talk about assessing team members within Telus on how they live what we call the Telus values. I'll tell you a little bit more about what that actually means, but the values themselves are supposed to be an embodiment of what we feel the organization and its people represent, and the type of environment that they wish to be actively involved in. And we actually assess our team members annually in how strongly and how well they demonstrate and apply the behaviors that represent these values. Another thing we do is we apply a decision-making process that I've described here in the third bullet. We call it FAIR process. It's a model for decision-making. It involves, engaging others, exploring the issues, explaining the problems, executing on the decision, and then evaluating the outcomes of that decision. But I think what's most important about this decision-making process is that it is inclusive. It isn't top-down. It isn't an ivory tower process. It's one that actually involves all affected stakeholders, and in that respect is equitable. And by engaging them in defining and finding the solution to the problem, it also encourages a sense of ownership, a sense of accountability for the decision that's ultimately made. I've kind of seen this process, and I've applied it myself in a number of situations at Telus, and it can be for something as benign as, organizing a potential office move to something a lot more complicated, and in all instances, it clearly creates more engaged team members. Now, we've tried to capture some of these disciplines in a framework that we call the Telus leadership philosophy, and I just thought I would flash this up here for you. It's essentially a representation, a diagram of what leadership means within Telus, and it's intended to kind of describe a framework that kind of supports our day-to-day actions, and it should apply regardless of your position, your level, or your experience in the organization. And you'll see on the outside that it's built on Telus's values. So you see the four identified here, and these, again, were built through a FAIR process where we engaged a representative sample of the company, and through that identified values that were intended to be representative of our culture. And then for each of these values, we identified specific attributes, so specific behaviors. And let me just give you as an example, the value of having the courage to innovate is demonstrated through behaviors that show people being creative, being willing to take on risk, and implementing those risk-based decisions. When we talk about, for example, having a passion for growth, what we look for there are individuals that are naturally curious, that believe in the value of learning, and who take a true interest in developing their team members. And you'll see that the FAIR process I was just talking about a little earlier is embedded in the second ring of this diagram, where we have the concepts of engaging, exploring, explaining, executing, and evaluating. And then in the center of this, we represent what is unique to Telus, which is our brand commitment of owning and being responsible for the success of the organization. So when I talked to you a little earlier about the leadership model, we talked about the concept of defining a strategy. And then I wanted to remind you a little bit of the importance of creating a culture that supports that strategy. And now I want to touch on some of the structural elements that support that end objective as well. I think as a leader, you have to create some structure around the implementation of your actual strategy. And it doesn't have to be particularly complex. There's a number of simple tools that I'm sure most of you have perhaps read about or used in the past. Clearly, one of them is the adoption of SMART objectives. So when you're laying out the goals or the objectives of your team, or perhaps maybe even for individuals that you support, they should be SMART. So they should be specific, which means essentially precise and understandable. They have to be measurable. So, you might need some help from your friends in accounting and in finance, but you want to devise metrics and targets that can be audited, that aren't necessarily always open, although they can have a subjective quality to them. It's best if they're married with some objective measure. And they should be achievable in the sense that, there should be a level of risk attached with a particular objective, but that level of difficulty should be commensurate with, the skills and the resources that you're making available to the individuals that are supporting that objective. And of course, it's got to be relevant, so it's got to be focused on achieving your strategy. And when we say time-bound, I think what we mean by that is you have to be mindful as a leader that you're measuring your progress against those objectives. We within Legal Service at Telus actually adopt this methodology. It gets captured in what we call a department scorecard, which is actually, to dumb it down, an Excel spreadsheet, and it looks like a scorecard that has a series of objectives and metrics. A lot of those objectives and metrics then flow down into individual personal performance objectives, and they're reviewed on a monthly basis. And that takes us to, the next step within the creation of a structure that supports leadership, and that is you need to be focused on creating that culture of appreciation and recognizing, if you will, the leadership values of others. And when you do that, it's important that when you review someone's performance, that you be mindful of a couple of very fundamental and important concepts. And the first is that when you're having these performance development discussions, make sure you're focusing on the priorities. Make sure you're actually focusing on the objectives that you set with those individuals, hopefully through a fair process, so that those individuals sort of understand that a performance assessment is going to be based on sort of tangible, understood requirements. And we've seen basically from employee surveys that we do on an annual basis that measures the state of engagement of Telus team members, that regular performance conversations that are focused on the clear objectives that have been set for those individuals simply result in better engagement. And we've had, over the last 10 years, a phenomenal increase in engagement as we've deployed these tools from, a survey score of in the 50s to now where we find ourselves in the mid-70s. So I think as a leader, you've got to remember that your focus should be, when you're having a performance conversation, to ensure that you are assessing against your objectives and that you provide support to those team members through through development opportunities, the ability to constantly improve, hone their skills and abilities to meet those objectives. That's an obvious segue into one of the perhaps most important aspect of our leadership model, and that's our people. And I think you've all heard repeatedly that people are perhaps the most important asset that we have, and that's true. But I wanted us to focus a little bit on, as a leader, how do you manage people? What's your responsibility? Well, I think at first you want to look at these individuals in the context of your strategy, your culture, and your structure. And you should be selecting and recruiting and developing people with those principles in mind. You should think of creating actual career development plans which achieve that result. And we have a number of, simple tools available to us at Telus, where we sit down with employees and we create, at the start of the year, a career development plan that's then included in all of our performance discussions to make clear that individual development is a shared responsibility. It's not you as a team leader that's responsible on your own to develop the people that you support. It has to be an exercise where the individuals themselves define and actually participate and seek out the development opportunities that are necessary. And I think that you do have an obligation to your team. I think they have a right to training, particularly for the roles that you've set for them. You've got to give them the resources and the learning required in order to achieve their responsibilities. And we do that within legal services by ensuring we provide to all of our counsel, I think, a generous professional development budget. That's just one of the tools that we use to ensure that, they can support their customized career development objectives as well as meet their professional development objectives, as well as have the necessary skills and resources required to support our objectives. And in closing, it's important that it may be a lofty goal to become a Michelin-starred chef, but if that's not aligned to your strategy and your individual objectives, it's a waste of time and it shouldn't feature on an individual's career development plan. Now, I think people is important when we look at it from the perspective of how we develop leaders. And I suppose we are lucky at Telus insofar as having a number of different leadership training programs. They're tailored to allow learning objectives that suit sort of the experience of its participants. The programs sort of allow progression into more complex and detailed leadership materials as people kind of grow their skills in their career. And then we have the senior leaders actually host and lead those forums so that, their internal experience kind of get cascaded out, and also give some of the new employees the opportunity to create networks with not just new team members, but with senior team members who can then mentor and coach and hopefully share some of their leadership tools and techniques. I think they're also an ideal time and place to sort of reinforce some of the important things we talked about a little earlier, like our corporate strategy. If you have something like a leadership philosophy or a set of values or a commitment to a particular set of objectives, those are all ideal subjects to add to your development sessions that hopefully you kind of tailor, as I said a little earlier, to the needs of your team members. And when we talk about our team members and their development, I think one of the most powerful and obvious tool that we all have as a leader when we're trying to influence groups is recognition. And Darren sort of shared with me a thought a while back about what that really means within Telus. He said that the form of leadership action that's most likely to lead to a team member's best day at work is simply support for making progress on that day, which should be followed by recognition for their work on that day. And when you're recognizing someone's contribution to achieving your objective, I think it's important to focus on how they've done what they've done as opposed to what they've actually done. Sorry, that's probably not a very articulate way of presenting the thought. I think what I'm trying to get at is within our leadership framework, if somebody in applying, the values and applying the fair process that we talked about a little earlier isn't successful in achieving an objective, but has nonetheless demonstrated all of the hallmarks of leadership that we were looking for, we should still recognize them. As a matter of fact, recognizing someone that hasn't succeeded yet adopted the techniques that you wanted them to is way more powerful than just acknowledging someone for having achieved a successful result. So that's an approach to recognition that I think is important, and that has to be in the back of your minds when you're thinking of your leadership tools and how to apply them to motivate your teams. Now, on the flip side of recognition, at the bottom of this particular slide, comes the challenge as a leader of having to work through people that I'll describe as chronically disengaged. It just doesn't matter what you do. These people are simply not part of or interested in achieving the same objectives that you're working towards. You have an obligation in those circumstances not only to keep your pulse on each individual's level of engagement, but deal with and remove instances of chronic disengagement. And the reason why you have that responsibility is it's been demonstrated that the negative impact, the disruptive influence of one chronically disengaged individual versus 10 that are highly motivated can seriously outweigh the benefits of the 10. And so you need to approach this from the perspective of if those team members can't ultimately become engaged and don't fit within the culture and don't believe in the strategy and don't support the objectives that you set for them, then it's time to exit. And it's time to do it in a disciplined way and obviously in a fair and direct way. Let me just pause here and see if we can get the first polling question up, please. All right, here it comes. So the polling question is asking, based on the material that I've sort of discussed with you so far, how many of you apply the following tools when leading your teams? You're a sophisticated group. You're kind of going all over the place here. Interesting. Still a little bit of movement. Good. Wow. All right, well, why don't we close it here? I mean, it looks like most of you have familiarity with SMART objectives, have used formal career plans. One of the things you obviously don't do and should start thinking about implementing is quarterly performance discussions. Thank you. Let's just go back to the deck now. And I won't repeat our customer first strategy, but I will just highlight a couple of things that, from our perspective, a leader is somebody that embraces the idea that the customer is our coach. In other words, in our business, the customer is first. And we also try to adopt within our organization a perspective on diversity that reflects the diversity of our customers as well, because we really believe that diversity of thought is important if we want it to be correctly reflected in our customers' expectations of Telus. The closing slides, which deal with health and wellness, leadership development, I think we can move through fairly quickly, and I would just like us to just pause and encourage you to take a moment to look at the effective leadership techniques that I have here on slide 24. We've touched most of these during the course of our discussion. I'd like you to refer to these as a helpful guidepost on your progression through your leadership experience and leave you with this thought, which I think is most important, and that is you probably have the most impact on any team member on any given day. And I think the reason why people are more apt to leave an organization, although we like to think, and we often are thought to think it's because of compensation, I often believe that it's because of a lack of meaningful work and because of an improper relationship that they have with the team members that lead them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel. And unfortunately, we've run a little bit over on our time, so we're not going to be able to have any Q&A for your module. But all the questions that have been sent in to you, we will log, and participants, rest assured, we will be able to send you those answers after today's presentation. So I'm going to turn over the floor now to Heather Turnbull of the Turnbull Consulting Group.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to be part of this conversation today for a couple of reasons. One, I've been the recipient of coaching and mentoring in my career, both within the volunteer component as well as my management consulting practice. And I just can't imagine where I'd be today without that assistance. It's been tremendously invaluable. And secondly, I think the environment, both here in North America as well as globally, is really rife for coaching and mentoring. And I say that because good coaching strategies and models really promote decision-making and problem-solving. And they have a strong emphasis on individuals taking self-responsibility as we move away from the hierarchical structure in organizations, and Telus is one of them, and I'm sure Canada Post is too. More and more individuals are being called upon to be more confident in making decisions on behalf of the organization as well as for themselves, and as well to be more in the way of taking risks. I know we do a lot in our organizations around risk assessment, and we sometimes foster a culture of being risk adverse. And if Canada is going to assume a spectacular role in resuming its innovative reputation in the world to get out and promote its products above and beyond the North American continent, we need to foster that in our organizations. And I think coaching and mentoring is one aspect of leadership that will certainly put Canada up on top again where it belongs. For the purposes of today, and as we move into the overview of some of the discussion points, and I have to say that what Michel has talked about already today has a lot of elegant overlap with what I'm going to share, especially with the leadership qualities. Humility is incredibly important. He also mentioned pressure points, and certainly for a martial artist that has a different connotation, but we'll leave that for another session. So in terms of touching on some of the aspects of coaching and mentoring today, I want to help you to distinguish between the difference between coaching and mentoring. They're used interchangeably, but the emphasis on today will be more around the coaching because for obvious reasons it has more application in the workplace. Also like to help you to understand and to recognize what a good coach looks like so that you as an individual can go out and recognize and recruit one for yourself, both inside and outside your businesses, and also to foster that in the upcoming generations who are working in your organizations. We need to be more mindful of how we add that to the competency and the attributes of the next generation of workers. I'll share with you one of the models that I've used in my practice. I find that models, the simpler they are, the more readily they are accessible and repeatable. And finally, to offer some resources, there are hundreds and hundreds of resources related to coaching and mentoring on the internet and also with business books, Harvard Business Review, and so on and so forth. But there's some ones that I found to be helpful, and I'll share those with you. As far as what you're going to walk out with today, the wow for you, I mentioned about the distinction between the coaching and the mentoring. I'll share with you some examples of that. Also of where you can point out and start to pinpoint coaching opportunities in the workplace, both formal and informal. One of the challenges that my clients often say is, how do I get the buy-in? Quite often a manager, supervisor, director will fancy themselves as a coach and they don't really have the attributes or the characteristics. Others want to be but don't quite have the formal training. Or the leadership and the culture in the organization doesn't really foster a coaching culture. And certainly if you're going to be implementing a coaching practice or a coaching methodology in your organization over the long term, and that's really the only way that it needs to go, you need to get that buy-in from the top, and it's got to be consistent. I mentioned as well about the appreciation of what effective coaching characteristics are, and the softer part of it, as we look at the science and the art of coaching, the yin and yang, as we say in the martial arts, what's the inspiration that you have to be an outstanding coach in your workplace and, in effect, in your life? As we think about in a moment of coaches and mentors who've inspired us throughout our lives, quite often they've started perhaps with a parent, a very influential teacher or a leader in our lives. That's really important as we think about the inspiration to be a good coach. Talked about the model a little bit, and finally some tips to make magic happen with your coaching efforts. First, I'd like to get sort of an indication from our audience today about what you think has been inspirational from a coaching perspective in your life, and certainly where you feel that a coach has made a difference or a mentor has made a difference. So think about that. Where would you be today without a coach or mentor in your life? seems that many of you have been the beneficiary of a coach or mentor. That's terrific. More. Okay. Looking like the majority of you have some tangible appreciation of the success that's been directly or indirectly wrought from having a good coach or a mentor. Okay. All right, we'll wrap up the polling at this point. Yeah, even getting some who haven't had the opportunity yet but would like to try it, and that's a great attitude to have. I want to help you and I understand a little bit about the differentiation between mentoring and coaching, and certainly as the program officer for the CCCA's mentoring program, we like to make that distinction for both the mentees as well as the mentors when they enter the program. Overall, mentoring is really defined as third-party wise counsel. It is really process wise, a little bit more relaxed. The outcomes can certainly be just as powerful as with coaching, but they certainly aren't tied necessarily to performance or job goals within an organization. They can be, as we say, an ad hoc sounding board, someone who's outside of your organization who isn't tied very directly to your on-the-job performance or has that accountability for coaching you to those next levels, especially within a career goal, for example. The relationship and the investment that the individual has in you as a mentor certainly could be off and on. It's not necessarily a regulated one. It could be an individual that you might call on, perhaps a little generational gap in terms of someone being a bit older that you may reference, or it could be a referral perhaps from your own parents who can, again, provide that guidance. Certainly as we look at in the CCCA mentoring program, it's the generation of mentors who have led the way, who certainly want to give back to the organization and to the profession, and have an appreciation for what they've gained as a result of having a guiding hand in their careers. For some of you who are aware of Mount Allison University, which according to the Maclean's poll continues to be one of the top undergrad schools, one of the former chancellors is Purdy Crawford, who's had a very distinguished career in law with Ostlers as well as Canada Trust, etc. Very interesting article in the latest issue of the Allisonian on mentorship, and as Purdy Crawford calls it, in my world, the word mentor is very rarely used. He just sees it as a wonderful opportunity to give back, to share, and as one of his mentees has mentioned in this article, Purdy has that great balance of listening and giving advice, but also forces you to come up with your own conclusion. So I thought that was a very elegant description of a mentor, and he continues to have a tremendous influence both in the not-for-profit as well as corporate worlds. Distinction with coaching, really there's more formal accountability for the results, and traditionally, especially in the North American market, coaching as it's embedded in the business world is really about job performance, setting the bar a little higher, or in fact trying to achieve that level of performance that's expected out of the role and within the particular division within the organization. There could be some very specific training aligned with that coaching or some additional learning, formal or informal. And again, that is part and parcel of that whole process involved in coaching. As I said at the outset, the connection to organizational and other goals is very important, especially for the buy-in, and certainly the cascading impact of performance evaluations is key, so that an individual seems connected and, in fact, engaged with the organization when they can see that their impact in their performance has a real tangible effect, whether it's shareholder, stakeholder value, whether it's customer delight. All of these things factor in, and the line that you can draw dotted or straight line between a person's contribution and the impact that a coaching intervention can have in terms of improving the value proposition for the organization is really very, very important. There could be some tangible or intangible rewards, some incentive programming, reward and recognition associated with it. Certainly here in Toronto, it's if you talk about an example of coaching, we're just about to ramp up to the Grey Cup, and lots of interviews as well about the coaching methodologies and the approach. So certainly within a sporting environment, coaches are very impactful. They work from a knowledge base, a plan, a format, a structure, and they have that other part of their component, especially around the intangible side, of being able to get a huge group of very talented, well-played professional athletes together and unified to produce an outstanding outcome. And by that, we hope that could be either a win for Calgary or a win for Toronto. So some characteristics of effective coaches, and Michel talked a little bit about that in terms of leadership, and there's elegant overlay. The open and approachability component is very important. Discretion and the ability to foster that trust with an individual. What's sort of said in the coaching environment stays in the coaching environment, unless it falls out of that, in which case there may be a need for an individual to talk to someone else, a professional, especially when there's a mental health concern. The asking of the difficult questions is, I think, and certainly related to being more open-ended questions. Coaching can and I think needs to be, especially in the business environment, a little bit like tough love, and the ability of the individual, the coach, to tease that out of an individual in a good way, to make the coachee think, to think outside of the proverbial box, and also to stretch themselves. To stretch them to a new level of performance and personal satisfaction is important. The trust, the humility, and the rock-solid integrity is absolutely huge. When we talk about earning the right, it's the modeling of the behavior, which is very important. Quite often we aren't able to exactly articulate what a great coach does, but we certainly should be able to recognize it when we see it. And that earned the right is really someone who has some bumps along the way, has some examples where they've perhaps failed and learned from their experiences. And I'm sure you have others that you've noticed as well, which are important. So here's one model to try. It's called the GROW model, and it's one of my personal favorites because it really started with John Whitmore, who's, I guess, been knighted now, Sir John Whitmore. He started out life as a race car driver, so he was very much performance-oriented. But came to a block in his career where he realized that he couldn't make sense of a lot of the coaching that was coming at him from an external perspective. And like most professionals, it took a lot of time to kind of assess where he needed to get better. And so out of that, as well as his alliance with a couple of other professionals at the time in the coaching environment, one as well who's done some work and called the inner game of tennis, they started looking at a model that was, first of all, repeatable, that was accessible for any environment, particularly within the business one, because it needed to be fast-paced, it needed to be reasonable, and it needed to be from a perspective of approachable for both the coach and the coachee. The reality, and I'll show you the model in just one second on the next slide, is really what is really happening in the moment, in this time, in your business environment. How do you really coach in real time, as opposed to trying to fathom through the aspects of what might happen or what could happen? It's very pragmatic, and when you're dealing in those situations and those examples, it has relevance for people, and it makes it doable for people to achieve those goals. The options aspect of it as well, and the opportunities are really, what is open to us, what can happen as a result of making some informed choices, and what will be different as a result of moving on any one of those opportunities or options. And the final component is the will or the way forward. How do we need to, in our minds, be responsible and have that incentive to make a change? And the change being in a behavior, in an attitude, and what's in it for us. There needs to be some quid pro quo in all of this for both the coach and the coachee, and then by extension the organization, making it certainly a win-win. And here's the model. It's that, and the explanation of the model is included in Whitmore's book, and as I say, in collaboration with Tim Galway with the Inner Game of Tennis and their other collaborator, Alan Fine. This has certainly proven to be a very adaptable model in a variety of circumstances. The commitment to action in the lower left-hand quadrant or part is very important, and at that point, as you see, that's usually the jump-off point to the next coaching intervention. I will say this, using this model over hundreds of applications very rarely goes in that direction as the arrows are pointed. There's an opportunity to certainly skip around with this. The important part is giving people enough opportunity to share and to set their own goals for this, and giving enough time in between the coaching sessions so an individual has an opportunity to go out, try it, then come back in and report on what happened. And that's very much respectful of adult learning principles. I will say with any model, whether it's the GROW model or any one that you choose to use in your practice, that there's certainly a comfort in having a model where you can kind of point out to and say, gee, this is where I'm stuck, or why do I not get some results in a particular area, especially if I'm encountering obstacles. So there's some flexibility built into it. The other aspect of it, of course, is it's a good, what I would call a professional pacifier. When people have a model in hand, then it's very helpful for them to understand about where they need some help and where they can certainly begin to get unstuck. So how do you get started? Talking with business leaders, that quite often can be the barrier to just jumping into it. And I always say to them, don't wait for an incident. We tend to be a society that loves to point out what goes wrong or where there are errors and retroactively try to fix them. We need to be looking at more of an Eastern model of keeping the body well, keeping the mind well, and fostering and working on strengths. So just jump in if you identify an individual in your organization who not necessarily struggling, but maybe could be underperforming, or you sense has some great upside potential and could benefit by a process, some accountability, some additional support. So look for those opportunities from a positive perspective rather than trying to fix something. Very important for the coach to kind of prepare yourself, get into that mindset and that image of how you need to model the behavior. And finally, from a point of interacting and getting that engagement with the coachee, setting that up from a perspective of getting them to say yes to the process. Make it easy for them to say yes. Yes, I'd like to be part of it, willing to explore it, go into that first session, explaining the process, and helping from a listening point of view. I always say, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Think about the proportion. Ask a lot of questions and listen for the kinds of responses from the coachee that will really say that, to you at least, that they're ready for this. Magic to the coaching. Finally, the engagement and the buy-in at all levels starts at the top. Jim Peters talks specifically about that. I know when he talks about leadership, he says that, when you try to get people to follow, that's the magic of it. especially when they have the freedom not to. As we deal with multi-generations in the workplace, it's really hard to motivate people and get them engaged unless you're tying into something that's really inspirational for them. Navigating the culture, we live in a wonderfully diverse cultural universe in the workplace now. There's the cultural intelligence, which is impacting as much now as CQ is. So how do we navigate through that, especially within a coaching process? We need to build that respect at all levels. A little bit more magic as I talk about the 3 I's, which is the inspiration, it's the innovation, and it's really the intensity of the process. Being consistent overall is really, really huge. And as we say, don't underestimate the humility aspect of it, because that really, really builds relationship and it builds incredible rapport with the coachee. And just to wrap up, here are some resources. Many of you have heard of Simon Sinek. He's a keynote speaker. I think the start with why is really important from any coaching perspective. Why did you do something, or why are you interested in it, and the models that you use. Flow from that. Certainly How to Win Friends and Influence People, I think, remains one of the seminal works on human relations skills. So I would encourage you to go to the Dale Carnegie website. There's a lot that you can glean from mentoring and coaching. The Economist article is terrific at differentiating between coaching and mentoring, and features Sir John Whitmore. And finally, the real-time coaching. That's another tool that you can use that may appeal to you more broadly than the GROW model.
Great,
so now,
thank you.
Yep,
Sorry.
we have time for a question and maybe an answer.
That's right. Thanks, Heather. I think we actually have time for a couple of questions. The first one I have here is, why is it that our industry no longer seems to encourage mentorship in a formal capacity?
I would suspect it's resources, and by that I mean time and human resources. It's certainly a very fast-paced environment, and like training and development, it often gets short shrift in terms of funding. But as I've shown here, you can do a coaching process or model in implementation in probably 5 minutes or less. I remember working with the CEO of one of the major brokerage houses, and he started his day at about 7:30 in the morning, and he had 7-minute coaching sessions with his, not his top producers, but that next tier. And as we know in sales, the top 10% usually produce 80 to 90% of your revenue. He wasn't concerned about the top 10%. He was concerned about that middle group that he felt had great potential. And so he invested a short coaching intervention and was able to tangibly move the majority of those middle performers up to the next tier.
Great, and just one last question. Is there a danger that mentoring someone can shift into becoming a personal therapist? Should I avoid that? If so, how?
Yes. You'll get what I call the tummy feel of, whoa, I think this is really leaching out of my personal capability to handle something. And the way to respond to it is this. Feel a little flattered, first of all, that you've created an environment of trust that an individual would share something with you, or something about their behavior that inclines you to think that they need professional help. And the way to respond to it is, I appreciate you sharing this with me. This is something that I would feel more comfortable in inviting another professional who's more skilled in this area to introduce to you, if that looks like an option for you. So it's a way to redirect the ask for some help. And have to say, in the environment of business today, there's a lot of fear. And it's a fear of failing. It's the fear of underperforming. It's a fear of trying to keep your job. And that cascades into, mental illness. And if you're not directly affected by that, you could be indirectly with a family member. And so your on-the-job performance is going to be affected, and there's a cracking point. And we're just beginning to understand the financial impact of that in the Canadian workplace. The very, very, I think it's underscored emphasis dollar-wise is $50 billion, but I suspect it's probably twice that. So that's a lot of impact to the bottom line when we're not dealing with the core impacts of good mental health and leading to excellent performance in the workplace. So be aware of it. It could come up in coaching interventions, and there's a way to handle it.
Great. Thank you, Heather. I'm going to turn the floor on over to Robert Fabes now.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Good afternoon to people east of me in Ottawa, and good morning to people west of me. Before I get started, just a little bit about Canada Post Corporation, just to give you a sense of where I come from in terms of my practice. We deliver to every address across Canada. In 2011, we delivered 10.6 billion pieces of mail to over 15 million addresses, and also managed a network of 6,500 post offices. To do that, we employ over 69,000 employees across Canada, 90% of which are unionized. So that, from that brief picture, you can just imagine that legal at Canada Post touches everything from labor and employment law, real estate law, sales contracts, procurement, just about everything except family law and wills and estates. I have the pleasure here at Canada Post of managing a team of 32 legal professionals in 4 offices across Canada. In other words, a fair-sized law firm. My comments today are based on my Canada Post experience, but also my experience being in-house when I was at GT Group Telecom, and notwithstanding that I had the lofty title of being General Counsel and Senior Vice President, when I first got to GT Group Telecom, I was the only lawyer there. And a lot of what I learned during my time at Group Telecom, I've been able to apply in the context here of Canada Post. While my session is about planning, that's a pretty broad topic, so I wanted to focus on 3 key aspects that I believe can make a difference and contribute to you and your team being viewed as a center of leadership in your organization. I want to talk about first work product efficiency, then financial planning, and then finally staffing and development. So turning first to work product efficiency, you can see the word objectives showing up 4 times on the page. To me, the objective of work product efficiency is doing the right work at the right time. And so I want to talk about some of the tools that can help you get there. Michel alluded to corporate objectives and corporate scorecards. These are very important because they help to remind you on a consistent basis that you're working to help move a business forward. You're not working in isolation. Just because you're a professional doesn't mean that you should have your own set of objectives independent from those of the organization you work for. And so really understanding what the corporate objectives are and how those corporate objectives are going to be measured through the overall corporate scorecard is a really important and effective tool for you. Here at Canada Post, those corporate objectives cascade down into the General Counsel's objectives and from her into me and then into my team members. If you actually had them in front of you, even for those of our paralegals and legal assistants, you could be able to track what we've tasked our team members with doing all the way up to what the board has asked the corporation to do. As Michel discussed, we do use the SMART objective system, but we have a big focus on objectives being result-oriented rather than just activities-based. And I want to give you a concrete example of that. A big part of what we do is help our sales force go out there and bring in revenue by getting contracts signed. And so we could look at, a metric being, number of sales contracts executed in a given period of, a quarter or for the year. But we've decided to tie our objectives to actually reducing the sales cycle, and more specifically, reducing the number of days it takes to get revenue into the door. I had a discussion with our SVP sales on really, in a nutshell, what it was he was trying to accomplish, and he was able to phrase it that way, and that's what I communicate to my team members who are helping our sales force. Similarly, there's often a challenge when putting together SMART objectives that are result-oriented for our legal assistants. But we look at things, something as simple as, are you producing documentation that's accurate, that actually reduces the lawyer's review time so that they can focus on other tasks? So we're really looking at results. The other piece of this is that it doesn't make sense to go through this intense and detailed objective setting process without monitoring objectives. When I'm talking about monitoring objectives, I'm not just talking about monitoring your own or your team's. I'm also talking about monitoring how the corporation is doing overall. There's two things that you need to remember, and they tie into why the monitoring of objectives is important. Number one, businesses aren't static, and things change. They change over a period of a year, and I agree with Michel. In some businesses, things change over the course of weeks, forget about months or years. And it's very important to make sure that what you're doing continues to be relevant to the organization, that you understand what's going on with the corporation's overall objectives. Similarly, and at an individual level, it's easy sometimes to get off track, and by paying attention and monitoring how you're doing and how your team members are doing, and doing that on a fairly regular basis, you can, head problems off before they develop into a crisis. My slide, you can see that I look at doing formal and informal reviews. The formal review process, depends on your organization, and I don't want to spend any time on that. Michel spoke about, the processes they have at Telus. I find, however, that a great corollary to the formal review is an informal review. I like the discussions in the hallways. I like the discussions at the water coolers, in the elevators. I look daily for opportunities to provide informal feedback and get a sense of what people are doing and how they're doing. Similarly, I don't do that just with my team members. I do that with our clients. It accomplishes two things. Number one, the clients can see that you're actually interested in what it is they're doing. And second of all, you get that ability to find out exactly what's going on in the organization. Canada Post, we're kind of fortunate because of the size of the organization. Communication of how the company is doing is done quite effectively, and we get corporate updates on a fairly regular basis. One of the other advantages that we have as lawyers, though, is we're often tied into the corporate secretariat function and what's going on at a board level. And as part of being part of the preparations for the board meetings, getting executives up to speed in order to be able to present to the board, that's another very informal way of finding out, how the corporation executive, how the board is viewing how the company is doing in terms of its stated objectives, and whether or not there's going to be any changes done along those lines. The other part of work product efficiency, and this ties into making sure work gets done at the right time, is helping to manage workflow. We all feel overwhelmed at times. We are all being asked to do more with less. But regardless of that, at the end of the day, we still have to meet our objectives. We still have to help the corporation move forward. One of the things you need to do is you need to be able to manage your clients. You need to, in an appropriate manner, set expectations as to what it is they need from you and when. One of the other things that I think helps manage your client is providing them with tools. Oftentimes lawyers are still viewed as operating in some amorphous sphere, which maybe sometimes does produce fear. Lawyers are sometimes viewed as being very protectionist of what they do and how they do it. We've found here, and I did this both at Canada Post and at Group Telecom, by actually providing clients with tools to help do some of the more routine work that could be classified as legal work. Two things happen. Number one, the clients develop an appreciation for what you do, and they appreciate being able to help in that process. And as a result of that, you end up being able to get them to do some of your work. The most obvious tool that helps with that is the creation of contract templates, and we try and even go beyond that by providing our clients with a number of pre-approved step-down clauses, which then they can use, provided that they've done the right checks within their own business group to make sure that the change to the risk profile of a given contract based on the use of the step-down still fits within an approved business case. Similarly, I also find that using workflow checklists is another helpful tool, and the reason for that is it helps the clients focus on at what stage is it the right stage to have legal involved, and what degree of involvement should legal have given the stage in the project. A very effective tool here at Canada Post. We prefer initially to be involved at the outset of the project so that the client knows that we're there to support them, but also so that we know exactly what it is the project is about and what the scope of it is. But then we like to be able to tailor our involvement so that we're not unduly interfering with the workflow of that particular project, and that we're used in an intelligent manner that makes best use of our resources given the project. The third point really is to communicate. I can't overemphasize that. Again, a use of informal and formal communication ensures that you know what's going on with your client, their expectations in terms of the project, and similarly, through that communication, you're building a continuing relationship, and also it gives you that ability, if you are encountering difficulties, to be able to discuss with them before they get blown up into something bigger. In addition, that communication is very important when you inevitably will run up the problem of competing priorities. Your sales team wants one thing, your real estate group wants another thing, you're limited in resources. You need to be able to have that dialogue in a meaningful way with your clients, And to be able to resolve those, I want to go back to your understanding of corporate objectives, because you can then bring in the current set of corporate objectives into your prioritization discussion to make sure that the discussion focuses on what's best for the overall organization as opposed to what's best for one particular business unit. The other aspect of managing workflow is to continue managing yourself and your team. You need to monitor progress, and while before I was talking about objectives that are results-based as opposed to activity-based, really in this stage of the equation, you're really looking at activity. At the end of the day, the work still needs to be done, and you need to get that sense that your team and yourself, that you really are doing the most to meet the commitments you've made to your client group. The next part of planning is something that not everybody necessarily enjoys tackling, but is a necessary evil. You need to understand, and I referred to this before, that even though you're providing a professional service to the organization, you still are part of the organization and you're funded by the organization. And regardless of whether or not budgets are in your control or not, you can add value and hence demonstrate leadership to your organization by being mindful of how the money is being spent. You can see here a number of items that you need to be aware of. I'm going to talk about external counsel fees in more detail. The other big ticket item, obviously, is salaries and benefits, which, rest assured, are not necessarily in your control. You may get some input into what appropriate salary levels are to be able to attract and retain talent in your organization, but that, of course, will only be done in the context of the overall corporate discussion on appropriate salaries and wages. Training, I just want to highlight, again, this becomes a really difficult issue, especially when times are lean. But as I'm going to discuss later, I think you need to view it and need to help your organization view it as an investment rather than just as a simple cost. So I now want to turn to external counsel fees, but before that, if we could pull up the fourth polling question. Which focuses on what approach you use in negotiating fees with external counsel. And we're asking you just to pick one out of the three as the most frequent approach. And we will stop it there. It looks like primarily people use discounted hourly rates, and then the rest of the vote is split between blended rates and fixed fees. Just out of interest, Michel, what approach do you generally use at Telus?
Hi, Robert. We tend to enter into preferred supply arrangements with specific firms that have key competencies and necessary practice areas for us. And these preferred arrangements are usually concluded after sort of an open competition. And through the open competition, we invite the firms to, provide different fee arrangements. And, we've seen everything from what you have here to a number of other sort of milestone or success-based billing arrangements. And I think part of it will really depend on the volume of work and the type of work that you're proposing for outside counsel.
Thanks, Michel. And Heather, what about in your experience or the experiences of your clients? What are you seeing, and is there anything not on the list that you or your clients have found helpful?
Mm-hmm. I can share two perspectives. One, for someone who is an employee coaching within an organization, that the budget that they need to acquire is really anchored to the deliverables or the outcomes of, say, a division. Sales is an easy one to do. So you're really asking for blocks of time, which of course is always at a premium to do the coaching, and then anchoring the results to one of the deliverables associated with it. For an independent or an outside consultant coaching to an organization, especially at senior levels, the arrangements are usually over blocks of time or coaching sessions. Considering it takes 21 days to develop a bad habit, let alone a good one, you need to do something over a period of time to build skill and certainly get the implementation results that you're looking for. So it could
Great.
be...
Thank you, Heather and Michel. Here at Canada Post, similar to Michel, we use a variety of approaches. But I guess the one that I really seem to have had the most success with is a blended rate approach. But the caveat to that is in terms of how you manage the external counsel relationship. A few things that I'm mindful of when setting up that relationship is, first and foremost, being crystal clear as to what the mandate is. And oftentimes, especially on bigger projects, I will, after doing an initial draft of a mandate with my internal client, I will send that mandate to external counsel to get some questions and comments back before finalizing the mandate and then giving the external counsel that mandate. We've spoken about fee arrangements, and I would encourage you to explore different options depending on the nature of the project, whether the project is unique, whether it's some commodity type of work. The nature of the project will lend itself differently to different type of fee arrangements. In terms of staffing files, this has been a key irritant for me in my time as external counsel. I really need to see the right people on the file doing the right work. It makes no sense to me to see a senior partner putting time in on basic research, and I don't want to see a junior associate doing final reviews of draft opinions. Also, the number of lawyers involved on the file has to be closely reviewed and expectations set in terms of that. Notwithstanding the sophistication of external counsel out there, I cannot tell you how many times I've been disappointed to receive a bill on a matter and I see 10 different lawyers billing on my one matter. So again, you need to be clear on the outside of that. The other tool we use here at Canada Post is a set of external counsel guidelines. Here are some of the topics that they cover. And if any of you, by the way, are interested in taking a look at what we actually use, I'm happy to share with them. I don't consider it a private document. Enough law firms out there have copies of this, given how much work we do with them. And this is a living, breathing document for us. We reissue it yearly to all of the external firms doing business with us. The one thing that I do want to highlight, I'm not going to go through all of these, going down to item 7, in terms of expenses and disbursements, we have quite a lengthy list in our document, and it's actually titled Unacceptable Disbursements or Charges. And we feel that, we need to be upfront about this. We operate on the principle that we believe that the fees that were charged by law firms should cover their overhead, and we should not be charged for that. Just to give you a flavor, and very quickly, we will not accept charges for scanning. We will not accept charges for electronic legal research on systems that are billed on a flat fee basis to the firm. That just gives a flavor of some of the things that we will not accept to be charged for. The last part of it, obviously, is the actual budgeting and budget cycle. You need to understand the cycle at your organization, but also similarly to reviewing your performance with your clients and with your staff on a fairly regular basis. We do monthly reviews of how we're doing vis-a-vis our budget. We also conduct forecast exercise. This keeps us honest. It lets us identify in a timely manner whether or not there's any pressures on the budget and allows us to act accordingly. And when you're doing the budget exercise for next year, while it's listed at number 5, probably the most important thing you need to have a handle on is what the corporate financial performance was the year, because that is going to generate the overall corporate budget for the coming year. The last topic I want to talk about is staffing and development. Michel and Heather both talked about the importance of developing people. I'm not focusing on that. The one thing I want to talk about in respect of staffing is making sure that you take the time to do an effective skills matrix of what skills are within your team, including your own, as well as what are the needs not just for your legal group, but also the needs of the organization as a whole. What are they currently, and what are they projected to be? Again, especially where your business is going to. And as part of that exercise, you'll be able to engage in succession planning, and you can use succession planning as a development tool, one of the tools in your development arsenal. The one thing I want to touch on in terms of training opportunities are the internal ones that go beyond what's just in your group. If it's all possible, and we found this to be very effective with our team, is to look for opportunities to second one of your team members to a business unit, but in a non-legal role. The experience and exposure they will gain there, not just for themselves, but to be able to bring back to the team, is immeasurable. So just on a closing note then, my view is that an in-house role is a significant leadership opportunity, given that you touch on all aspects of the organization's business. Using effective planning, then, is just a tool in your arsenal to be able to maximize that leadership opportunity. So, Sherry, I'll turn it back to you. I don't know if we have time for questions.
No, as a matter of fact, I think we're out of time. It's 1:30, and we want to be respectful. We know everyone is moving on to their next appointment. So I will remind our registrants that we'll be sending all of the unanswered questions and answers to you with your slides and a recording of today's presentation. So I think with that, I would like to conclude today's session by thanking Michel, Heather, and Robert. You've each provided us with some essential information on leadership and practice management. Again, to all participants, thank you for attending our online webinar. And if you're interested in receiving more guidance from any of our speakers, you'll find their contact information provided on your screen. Again, please note that a recording of your webinar will be sent to you in the coming weeks along with the slides and those unanswered questions. So we now invite you to take a couple of minutes to complete a brief survey to be entered into a draw to win $100. To access the survey, please keep your browser window open and click on the link provided. Your input is especially valuable to us as we will use your feedback to craft future online webinars. Thank you again, and good luck in the survey prize draw.